Hello, everyone. It's André, back again at BAP 2024 here in Birmingham, and I'm here with Professor Allan Young from King's College London, and you head up the Centre for Affective Disorders.
I do, and I'm editor of the Journal of Psychopharmacology, which is the Society's journal.
You're giving a talk on Wednesday, and it's one of those kind of broad sweep talks entitled From Cade to Ketamine, as in John Cade, I imagine, the guy that discovered lithium. So you're talking about the kind of broad sweep of treatments for affective disorders over the last, 100 years or so?
Not quite 100 years. This is our 50th anniversary of the BAP, so that goes back to 1974. But if we think about the era of modern treatments, modern drug treatments in psychiatry, it really kicks off with John Cade in 1949. Cade is a fascinating figure. He was a psychiatrist in Australia. He was in the Changi prisoner of war camp during World War II, where he ran the Australian part of the hospital which was concerned with people with psychiatric illness. And he did lots of experiments with lithium, and is really the figure who reintroduced lithium back into medicine. Lithium had been used as a cure for gout, but had been banned by the FDA a few years before because of toxic side effects related to the kidney because of high blood levels. So Cade collected urine from his patients, stored it in his wife's refrigerator, and injected it to guinea pigs, and then extrapolated from that and gave lithium to patients, some of whom miraculously got better. But then, tragically, some suffered from side effects, and some died of toxicity. There's an unsung hero called Ernest Trautner, who was a refugee from Europe who went to Melbourne. And Trautner was a very skilled, what we now call a clinical biochemist. And he worked out the correct therapeutic ranges that you could give, along with a young psychiatrist called Samuel Gershon, who's still around who went to the States after that. So it's a very interesting story about a lone wolf who had a theory, who gave it to patients, and then there needs to be a huge amount of work afterwards in working out the correct dose. The baton was picked up by a man called Mogens Schou in Denmark, who really did what we would call experimental medicine. And you go on in the story, we've now got lithium still being done in big studies to try and establish the biomarkers. And I think it's an exemplary tale of drug discovery, and something that when we're at our 50th anniversary, we would be minded to celebrate and remember. And we can see how things have changed, how much better we are at these things. But I think one of the key messages is that inspired clinical observation, what you might call serendipity, looking at the effects of treatments in patients, is still, I think, a key part of discovery of any new type of treatment, and is still actually perhaps being neglected a bit, because we're in danger of thinking we know too much about the science and we understand the brain too well, and avoiding the experience of patients and their response to therapies.
It's a story of drug discovery, as you say, but it's also a story of drug repurposing, which is where we're at now, isn't it?
It's where we've always been at in psychiatry. Lithium was repurposed gout treatment. We've got the antipsychotics, which were repurposed essentially as anesthetic or pre-anesthetic agent. The first antidepressants were actually designed to be like antipsychotics. That's the tricyclics. The MAOIs were derived from drugs used to treat tuberculosis. We've got the anticonvulsants, which were used, of course, in epilepsy, and so on and so forth. So really, repurposing drugs is the rule rather than the exception in psychiatry. And that brings us to ketamine. There's a saying along the lines of success has many parents. And there's a number of groups in the States and other places that claim they did the first studies with ketamine. Ketamine, of course, is a dissociative anesthetic agent, and it doesn't depress your respiration. And that's why it's used in field hospitals or for veterinary settings, because you can't intubate and supply the ventilation to keep people or animals alive. But of course, its use in psychiatry can be traced back. The first paper we've been able to find, and I'm going to show this in my talk, is fascinatingly from the early 70s from Iran. And the methodology that they used was actually very interesting, because they gave ketamine pretty similar doses to what we give now, And they gave it to a wide range of psychiatric conditions. And they almost used it more. We now we have the paradigm for psychedelics. So ketamine and S-ketamine have migrated to being more of a very medical treatment in a setting where you measure blood pressure and do all that sort of stuff. But the first paper describes using ketamine in what's described as an abreactive way, which is a bit like the way we think about psychedelic agents. And of course, being from Iran in the 1970s, this was more or less forgotten about. There were then some papers in Australia about using ketamine in people with end-of-life depression when they were dying from cancer, and you use ketamine for pain. And then, of course, the Americans discovered it, and there's the old joke that the National Institutes of Health, NIH, really stands for not invented here, because they'll take something from somewhere else and trademark it or brand it or whatever. That's just a joke, folks, but most jokes have got an element of truth in it. But I think ketamine's an interesting story as well. We're now beginning to do what happens with all drugs, where you think it works in this indication, we'll try ketamine. And we're doing trials of ketamine in anorexia nervosa and alcohol problems and so on and so forth. I think drug discovery, drug development, treatment development is something that we should all be concerned with. At times like this, it's good to learn from the past and think about lessons that we can learn from the future, and also maybe think about some of the things which we've forgotten about the past. And that's why studying Cade's journey and the early history of ketamine use can be things that we could really benefit from reflecting on.
It's really easy to get excited about a specific intervention. There's a lot of people here that are excited about the psychedelics or excited about ketamine. I wonder what you're most excited about in terms of how we're doing mental health science, looking forward for the next 50 years. What are the really major differences, do you think, that are going to move the field forward?
I think it's a bit of a roller coaster. In the 50s, 60s, and maybe even the 70s, we saw lithium, tricyclics, MAIs, the antipsychotics, anticonvulsants being introduced. And then we had Me Too drugs, which were essentially very similar. So we had the second generation antipsychotics, we had the SSRIs and so on. And these weren't really that different. There were perhaps side effects and toxicity safety benefits, but they really weren't a game changer. It wasn't going from the sail ship to the steamship. It was going to a better type of sail ship. But I think we've now seen new mechanisms. There was a period maybe starting at the turn of the century when the whole field seemed dead. And it's been reinvigorated by psychedelics, by ketamine and so on. I'm very hopeful that lithium can be reinvigorated by the biomarker studies that we're doing, which might allow us to target it to those people who will do best. So I think we're living through a very interesting, exciting era. I think in certainly the next 10 years, maybe the next 20 years, we'll see things change in a way which didn't seem likely to happen when everything seemed becalmed and in the doldrums, maybe first half of the second decade of this century. But one note of caution is that any treatment, whether it's an operation, a therapy, or a drug, is a balance between benefits and harms. And of course, this goes back to Hippocrates and probably similar figures in other cultures. And Hippocrates said, of course, in ancient Greek, first do no harm. So we must be aware that we need to establish efficacy, but also we need to quantify the harms. And of course, in some ways, we're the most evolved and we have the most sophisticated methodology for doing this with drugs. Some other areas of intervention, people still say psychotherapy can't have side effects. That's nonsense. Of course it can. Similarly, devices, operations, they're not as good. But for drugs, we need to always look at the side effects. We need to look at them in the rounds. We need to balance them with the benefits, not only for the group level, but also for the individual. So there may be a particular side effect which most people don't find too much hassle, but you individually really don't like it. So you must bear that in mind when we're in the clinician-patient relationship. And also, it never really ends for drugs. We need to follow them up. And there's lots of examples of this where drugs have been around for a long time. First, do no harm. We think these drugs are, these new therapies like psychedelics, ketamine and so on, they're very interesting. There's a huge upbeat about the efficacy. But remember, we have to assess the potential for harm as well. And we should always do that.
Thank you very much for taking the time to talk to me.
Thank you again, André.